Today, we are going to discuss on the topic psychoanalysis, which is developed by Sigmund Freud. The psychoanalytic system is a model of personality development and an approach to psychotherapy. His approach is ongoing attention to factors that motivate behavior, focusing on the role of unconscious self of human. This presentation is done by Angel Mariya Dominic and Rosemary Paul, second sem MSW students of Loyola College of Social Sciences, Trivandrum. The content of our presentation include a biographic brief of Sigmund Freud with respect to his personal and professional life. The objective of psychoanalysis. This area addresses why psychoanalysis is considered as a therapy and what are the objectives of traditional and modern psychoanalytic therapy. Another concept we introduce is about the development of psychoanalysis from Freudian therapy to recent practices. The theoretical concept which psychoanalysis dealt is also tried to incorporate in our presentation. Moving forward, psychoanalysis uses its own techniques while it is done in practical aspect. Such techniques are discussed in brief. Every theoretical perspectives and approaches undergo criticism when socio-cultural context changes with time. Such criticism to psychoanalysis is added in this presentation. Then, Sigmund Freud, a brief background. Sigmund Freud was the first born to Jacob and Amalia Nathanson in 1856 at Freiburg. Freud's early life was comprised with traumatic losses. He lost his mother's brother, his own brother and nanny. His family lost their business which forced them to go for migration. Even though his family had limited finance, his parents made effort to support his intellectual capacity. Before reaching at the age of 10, he was followed by 6 more siblings, which created a demand for love in him. This demand for love from mother was defined as the concept of Oedipus complex by Freud himself. He was planning to enter School of Law and Politics. Later, he made sudden turn to the field of medicine at the University of Vienna. When any historian made an evaluation on Freud's career life, he must move through the field of science, medicine, and neurology. His experience in General Hospital from 1882 enriched practical knowledge base in surgery, internal medicine, psychiatry, and nervous diseases. On the basis of clinical experience, Freud formulated various writings in hysteria. He was diagnosed with mouth cancer in 1923. Even though he was ill and bedridden, he continued to treat patients and publish work. He passed away in 23rd September 1939. Next slide. When we move through the objectives of psychoanalysis, we can identify that psychoanalysis aims to make the unconscious conscious. It is also to help the client to develop greater ego control, which balance pleasure principle, that is id, and morality principle, superego. And psychoanalysis helps the client to replace maladaptive or unhealthy internalized object that causes behavioral changes by adaptive internalized object. It also enables the client to repair self-defect if any, they are detected through enabling clients on awareness. Next slide. When we move through the genesis of psychoanalysis, we can find that psychoanalytic theory continues to evolve. Freud emphasized intrapsychic conflicts where Neo-Freudian school moved from the orthodox position and contributed the expansion of psychoanalytic movement by incorporating the cultural and social influence of personality. Then the next development is ego psychology. Ego psychology is a part of classical psychoanalysis, which give emphasis on it, ego and superego, and also in Anna Freud's identification of defense mechanisms. She spent most in adapting psychoanalysis to children and adolescent group. Erikson expanded the perspective of Anna Freud by emphasizing psychosocial development throughout the lifespan of an individual. Today, the psychoanalytic theory is comprised of a variety of schools, including the classical perspective, ego psychology, object relation and interpersonal psychoanalysis, self-psychology, and relational psychoanalysis. Objective relational theory is about our relationship with other people are affected by the way we have internalized our experience of others and set up representation of other within ourselves. Object relation are interpersonal relationship which influence our interaction with the people around us. The term object was used by Freud to refer to which satisfied any need of an individual. Next development is about self-psychology. And self-psychology grew out of the work of Heinz Kohut, which gave emphasis on the use of interpersonal relationship to develop our own sense of self. Then Kohut, along with his other self-psychologists, gave emphasis on empathy in forefront of analytic healing, which give the therapist to choose the intervention to the client. The relational model is based on the assumption that theory is an interactive process between the client and the therapist. The relation of the analyst put value on knowing and approaching client with genuine curiosity. The therapist expect to participate in mutual enactment or repetition of the theme from the client's life to evoke themes of their own. From the time of Freud to the late 20th century, the power between analyst and the patient is unequal. In the traditional perspectives, it is something authoritative in nature, and in modern, it is something more egalitarian, which give emphasis to values like empathy. Next slide. When we move through the concept, we can identify the divisions of unconscious, pre-conscious, and conscious, which is developed by Sigmund Freud. Freud studied the human mind on the basis of sensory threshold. Conscious below the threshold of conscious experience. This includes our current thoughts, whatever we are thinking about or experiencing at that given moment. The pre-conscious deals with the memories that are not part of the current thought, but can be readily be brought to the mind if a need is arised. Then the unconscious. Unconscious is about the thoughts and desires and impulses which remain largely unaware. The unconscious cannot be studied directly, but is inferred from behavior. It can be through dream analysis, analysis of slip of tongue, and material derived from free association techniques. Like the greater part of iceberg that lies below the surface of water, the larger part of the mind exists below the surface of awareness. The unconscious stores all experience, memories, and repressed material. The aim of psychoanalytic therapy is to make that unconscious motives conscious. According to Freud, unconscious process root all the forms of neurotic symptoms and behavior. In psychotherapy, cure is based on uncovering the meaning of symptoms, the cause of behavior, and the repressed material that interfere with healthy functioning. Another concept of anxiety is also can be identified when we study psychoanalysis. Next slide. Okay, anxiety is a feeling of dread that result from repressed feeling, memories, desires, and experiences that emerge to the surface of awareness. It can be considered as a state of tension that motivates us to do something. It develops out of the conflict among the ego and superego. There are three kinds of anxieties: reality anxiety, neurotic anxiety, and morality anxiety. Reality anxiety is the fear of danger from external world, and the level of such anxiety is proportionate to the degree of real threat. Neurotic anxiety is the fear that the instinct will get out of hand and cause the person to do something from which he or she will be punished. And morality anxiety is the fear of one's own conscience. People with a well-developed conscience tend to feel guilt when they do something contrary to their moral code.
According to structural model introduced by Sigmund Freud in 1923, he proposed three structures of personality, specifically id, ego, and superego. First, let us discuss about id. It contains primitive, innate urges, includes various bodily needs, sexual desire, aggressive impulses. According to Freud, the id is the pleasure principle. It demands immediate total gratification. Next, we are going on to the second structure called ego. Part of personality that account of external reality in the expression of instinctive sexual and aggressive urges. It is in response to these facts that the second structure of personality, the ego, develops. Ego operates in accordance with reality principle. As next, we are moving on to the third structure as per Sigmund Freud, and the structure is called superego. Superego is formed out of the internalized or introjected value of parents and society and becomes the person's conscience from which an ego ideal, the statement by which one measures oneself, is formed. Morality principle is through nurture. In this slide, we are going to discuss about anxiety and defense mechanisms. In constant struggle to prevent eruption of dangerous impulse, ego faces difficulty. Freud believed that when the ego feels it may be unable to control impulses from the id, it experiences anxiety. To reduce such feelings, the ego uses various defense mechanisms. There are repression, rationalization, displacement, projection, and regression. Let's move on to its definitions. Repression. The ego pushes disturbing or threatening thoughts out of one's consciousness. Rationalization is a defense mechanism, an unconscious attempt to avoid addressing the underlying reasons for a behavior. Rationalizing an event may help individuals maintain self-respect or avoid guilty over something they have done wrong. Next is displacement. The individual satisfies an impulse by acting on a substitute object or person in a socially unacceptable way. For example, releasing frustration directed towards your boss on your spouse instead. And the next one is projection. The ego attempts to solve discomfort by attributing the individual's unacceptable thoughts, feelings, and motives to another person. Regression. As a defense mechanism, the individual moves back in development in order to cope with stress. For example, an overwhelmed adult acting like a child. Here we are going to discuss about the psychoanalytic techniques. They are transference and countertransference, resistance, free association, interpretation, dream analysis, and defense mechanism analysis. Transference analysis. Transference is the term for the unconscious repetition in the here and now of conflicts from the client's past. Transference analysis refers to the systematic analysis of the transference implications of the patient's total verbal and non-verbal manifestations in the hours as well as the patient's direct and implicit communicative efforts to influence the analyst in a certain direction. This analysis of the patient's transference is an essential component of psychoanalysis and is the main driver of change in treatment. In transference analysis, the analyst takes note of all communication, both verbal and non-verbal. The client engages in and puts together a theory on what leads to the defense mechanism he or she displaces. That theory forms the basis for any attempts to change the behavior or character of the client. Next one is counter-transference. Counter-transference analysis. This final key component of psychoanalysis is the analysis of counter-transference. The analyst's reactions to clients and the material they present in sections. Counter-transference analysis can be generally understood as the analyst attempts to analyze their own reactions to the client, whatever from they take. To engage in psychoanalytic treatment, the analyst must see the client objectively and understand the transference happening in the client and in their own experience. Next is resistance. Resistance in psychoanalysis refers to oppositional behavior when an individual's unconscious defenses of the ego are threatened by an external source. Resistance manifests itself in all the ways in which the subject breaks the fundamental rule of saying everything that comes into his mind. Then free association. Free association is a practice in psychoanalysis therapy. In this practice, a therapist asks a person in therapy to freely share thoughts, words, and anything else that comes to mind. The thought need not be coherent, but it may help. If they are authentic. According to Freud, many of our thoughts and actions are determined by our unconsciousness, which largely forms during early childhood. This area of the mind is difficult for the individual to access on their own. So the role of the therapist is to help the patient understand themselves better through subconscious mind exercises like free association and even hypnotism. Freud used this saying, all roads lead to Rome, to refer to his idea that anything you say or do eventually leads back to the source of your problems. To Freud, a simple slip of the tongue was significant. In his view, misstatements were revelatory. A deeper interpretation would lead to the heart of your basic problem. After listening to his patient's random thoughts, Freud would analyze the information to find the hidden meaning. The goal of psychoanalysis was to find the source of your problem and reveal it to you. Freud's thinking was that once you understood what was causing you to think or behave in ill-adaptive way, the problem would naturally resolve for you. The next one is interpretation. Interpretation is the verbal communication between analysts and clients, in which analysts discuss their hypothesis of their clients' unconscious conflicts. Generally, analysts will help clients see the defensive mechanisms they are using and the context of the defensive mechanisms or the impulsive relationship against which the mechanism was developed. And finally, the client's motivation for the mechanism. There are three classifications of interpretation. The first one is clarification, if which the analyst attempts to clarify what is going on in the patient's consciousness. The second one is confrontation, which is bringing non-verbal aspects of the client's behavior into his or her awareness. And the third one is interpretation proper, which refers to the analyst's proposed hypothesis of the unconscious meaning that relates all the aspects of the client's communication with one another. Next is dream analysis. Dream analysis is a therapeutic technique best known for its use in psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud viewed dream analysis as the royal road to the unconscious and developed dream analysis or dream interpretation as a way to trapping into the unconscious material. The last one is defense mechanism analysis. Defense mechanisms are psychological strategies that are unconsciously used to protect a person from anxiety arising from unacceptable thoughts or feelings. Why do we need ego defenses? Why do we need ego defenses? We use defense mechanisms to protect ourselves from feeling of anxiety or guilt, which arise because we feel threatened or because our id or superego becomes too demanding. Defense mechanisms operate at an unconscious level and help ward off unpleasant feelings or make good things feel better for the individual. Ego defense mechanisms are natural and normal. When they get out of proportion, neurosis develop, such as anxiety stages, phobias, obsessions, or hysteria. There are mainly three criticisms. The first one is severely disturbed clients lack the level of ego strength needed for treatment. The second criticism is availability of trained experts is very less. And the third criticism is the limited application of practical techniques. Then the limitations of the psychoanalysis theory are it is a traditional approach, so it takes long time to get cured. And the second one is from feministic perspective, limitations to some Freudian concepts like Oedipus complex and Electra complex. And the third one is this theory is more or less irrelevant to contemporary culture. Thank you for listening to us.